Good morning. It's so great to be here with you all. I had the opportunity last year to spend a few months working at a hospital in Togo in West Africa. Togo was ranked by the UN as the least happy country in the world. And there's a new hospital that opened in northern Togo in a rural part of the country, and I volunteered to go and work there. So I flew into the country's only airport, which is in the capital city called Lomé, which is down on the coast. The hospital is a 9-hour drive north from there. I had to spend the night in the capital city waiting for my driver to come pick me up and take me to the hospital. And when I got to the guest house that I was staying at that first night, I realized that the staff there spoke zero English. They only spoke French. And I only took like 2 years of French in high school, and that was a little while ago. But we had to rely on my rusty knowledge of French in order to be able to try to communicate. Within an hour of being at this guest house, I managed to make a total, complete idiot out of myself. Instead of telling them that their Wi-Fi wasn't working, I told them that their internet was unemployed. And then they asked if I wanted bread with my dinner, and I said yes, but. So here's the deal. I had read these food safety guidelines before I left, and it said that when you buy bread at the market, you're supposed to bring it home and bake it again to kill off all the germs that it might have gotten on it from people's hands touching it. Okay, so they asked if I want bread. I said yes, but. And then I tried to tell them in French everything I just told you all in English, except I lacked really key vocab words. Like I didn't know how to say bake, or oven, or germs. And so what I told the cook was, yes, I would like bread with my dinner, but you have to set my bread on fire. I said, if my bread is not on fire, it will make me very sick, and your bread not on fire could actually kill me. And they looked at me like I was some crazy woman from America who was asking for a pan of flaming bread. Okay, so then a couple minutes later, the cook brings me this beautiful plate of food, and I realized that I have not eaten in almost 24 hours, and I was starving. And so I looked at this beautiful plate, and what I meant to say was, wow, I'm really hungry, which in French is j'ai faim. But what I said instead was j'ai une femme, which means I sat down, looked at a beautiful plate of food, and exclaimed in French, wow, I have a wife. Needless to say, the following morning when my driver showed up, these guys were super stoked that this crazy American woman was leaving. So my driver suggested before we set out on this 9-hour trip that we sit down and have breakfast together. So we did, and while we're eating, he asked me to tell him about my story. So I told him my story. When I was 27 years old, I was living on the East Coast. I'd gotten a master's degree in medicine from Yale, and I was earning a master's in journalism from Columbia. And all of a sudden, out of the blue, I was diagnosed with breast cancer. I had 5 surgeries, I had chemotherapy, I had radiation, and in the end, I almost died of pneumonia. During that time, my whole life went to pieces. The guy that I thought I was going to marry, we just picked out rings, and he asked my dad if he could marry me. Through the chemo and the surgery and through that whole process, he ended up breaking up with me. And then my good friend died of cancer. My car got hit by a truck in the parking lot of my apartment building. Like everything that could go wrong went wrong all at the same time. And in the end, I thought the pieces of my life here are too broken to even think about putting them back together, so I'm just going to bail. And that's what I did. While I was still in the hospital, for some reason, I don't know why, but the ICU has free Wi-Fi. So I pulled out my laptop, I logged on, and I Craigslisted my apartment. I sold all my stuff, I resigned my job, and I bought a one-way ticket to Portland, Oregon, because it was as far away as I could get from Connecticut without dropping off into the ocean. And shortly after I got out of the hospital, that's exactly what I did. I packed a suitcase of clothes, I got on a plane, I left for Portland, and I landed there on a rainy Sunday night, and I remember standing there on the sidewalk in the rain, waiting for my friend to come pick me up, and I was this bald, scarred, broken mess of a girl. And as I watched people coming and going all around me, who all seemed like they had a place to go, a place to be, and people who loved them, I've never felt so lost and invisible in all my life. Shortly after I got to Portland, I was riding the Max, which is the light rail train, one afternoon when the Somali woman got on the train with her 2 little girls who were ages 3 and 4. The mom and the 4-year-old found seats, but there wasn't a seat for the 3-year-old. And so this little girl was standing up next to her mom's knee, and she was trying to fall asleep and stand up at the same time. And I watched her kind of nod off, almost topple over, and then startle awake. And she did this several times. And I looked at her and I thought, somebody should hold that little girl. She's so tired. And the second that thought went through my head, the little girl opened her eyes and she looked up at me. And so I held my arms out like this, and she climbed into my lap and she fell asleep. Well, now I'm thinking, I'm holding a stranger's child, and this doesn't look good, and I need to make contact with her mom so that she doesn't think that some crazy American woman just tried to snatch her kid. And so I looked at the mom, and I started asking her to tell me her story. And she said that she and her husband were refugees from Somalia. She had 5 little girls under the age of 9. She had 3 sons who died before they had a chance to get out. They landed here. Her husband had been abusive to her and then left them, and she was all by herself. She didn't have anywhere to go. She didn't have any food. She didn't have any money. She didn't have a job. She didn't know a soul, and she barely spoke 8 words of English. And when she ran out of vocabulary words to tell me more about their story, she simply shook her head and she began to cry. And she said, "It's too much. It's too much." And I thought, I recognized the look in that woman's eyes, because that's the look I had in my eyes when I got to Portland, when I had almost died and I was thousands of miles away from home and I'd lost everything I cared about and I had no idea how to start over again. And so I just had this instant connection with this woman. And I asked for her address, and a few days later, I went to check on her. I found that she and her girls were living in this tiny little apartment. It was freezing cold because no one had showed her how to turn on the heat. They had nothing in their house, so the living room was empty. The bedroom was empty except for one blanket that they shared among the 6 of them when they huddled together to sleep at night. They just had the clothes on their backs. They didn't have pajamas or a change of underwear or socks. They didn't have any toiletries or towels in the bathroom. Their kitchen cabinets were totally empty. And when the mom had finished giving me this tour of their empty home, we came around the corner and we saw that her 5 little girls were sitting in a circle on the empty dining room floor, and they were eating moldy bread dipped in ketchup because the mom had taken to dumpster diving to try to find her girls' food, and this is all their mom had found in the trash the night before. At that point, I'd never been to Africa. I'm not a social worker. I'd never met a refugee, but I thought, I'm a human being and I'm a follower of Jesus, and I'm just going to do whatever I can to let this woman and her little girls know that they are loved, that they are seen, that they are not alone. And so I took them some food, and then I took them some clothes, and then my church got involved, and we did this big extreme home makeover event where in one night we descended on their apartment and filled it up with all the furniture and toys and food that they needed to begin to not only survive, but to thrive in their new life here in America. The whole time that we were helping them get back on their feet, I was blogging about them because these little girls were the most fascinating, amazing girls that I had ever met, and their story was phenomenal. So, for instance, this one time when I actually showed the mom how to turn on the heat in their apartment, the little girls ran around screaming that I set their house on fire because there's hot air coming from behind a wall, and they have no idea how it's happening except that there's a fire back there, and they know that I'm the one that flipped a switch and started it. Okay, so anyway, I ended up turning the blog into a book, and it's called The Invisible Girls. We have the copies for sale out here in the lobby if you'd like to get a signed copy. And all of the profits from the book go into a college fund for the 5 little girls that I wrote about. So when my driver in Togo that morning asked me to tell him my story, this is the story I told him. And afterwards, after I finished speaking, we sat in silence for a moment, and he nodded, and he very wisely and quietly said, "Yeah." He said, "Love looks around." I said, "It does, doesn't it?" Love looks around and sees the people who are marginalized and invisible, who often go overlooked and unseen and unloved. Love looks around. And then we were quiet for another minute, and then he said, "Speaking of looking around," he said, "We're about to make this 9-hour drive. There's only one road that goes north, and parts of it are very desolate, and so there are often armed robbers who jump out and hijack people, and sometimes they just take the car and leave the people alone, and sometimes they shoot the people inside the car. He said, so speaking of looking around, as we're driving, I would like you to look around and tell me if you see any men with guns. Okay, I didn't know that you could go 9 hours without blinking, but I think I did it that day. My eyes are peeled. Thankfully, that didn't happen. We arrived safely up at the hospital, and I began to work there. My shifts were 28 hours long. I would show up at the hospital 7 o'clock in the morning, work all through the day, all through the night, into the morning, and then once I rounded on people at 11 or noon, I would be off. I saw people die of crazy things that I'd only heard about in textbooks before. There was AIDS and malaria and hepatitis and tuberculosis. We had a little girl who's 5 months old. Her mom pierced her ears. The little girl died of tetanus because they don't have pediatric immunizations. I watched a little baby girl seized to death because she didn't have what in the U.S. would be a $20 shot. There are so many stories I can tell you from the hospital, but there's just one that I'm going to talk about this morning because it's one that I will never be able to remove from my heart. One afternoon, I was working, and a father carried in his little baby girl who was 2 years old who was having a seizure. We quickly figured out that she had what's called cerebral malaria. So malaria is a parasite that's transmitted by a mosquito, and in children under 5, it often travels to their brain, and it causes them to have seizures, it puts them in a coma, and often leads to their death. We gave her the best medicine that we had for seizures and for malaria, and yet she kept seizing anyway. Every time she had a seizure, she stopped breathing, and the hospital couldn't afford a ventilator, so I had to stand there and breathe for her the whole time. We worked on her all through the afternoon and into the night, and finally I looked at my watch. It was 2 o'clock in the morning. I had been standing by this little girl's crib for 10 hours, breathing for her. And I had checked her pupils at 2 a.m., and they were uneven, which meant that this little girl was starting to have irreversible brain damage. But I couldn't stop trying to bring this little girl back to life because I couldn't imagine the grief that her father would feel if he lost his little girl. So I kept going, and so now it's 3 o'clock in the morning, then 4, then 5. Finally, at 6 o'clock in the morning, I checked her pupils again, and her pupils were blown, which meant that this little baby was brain dead, and she was gone. Her father had been standing behind me the entire time, looking over my shoulder. And at 6 o'clock in the morning, I put down the oxygen mask, and I simply turned to him, and I shook my head, and he ran out of the hospital. I went after him to find out where he'd gone, and I found that it was sunrise. The sun was just starting to come up, and this man was kneeling in the dirt, weeping, bowing east because he's Muslim and he was praying to Mecca. I left him alone. I went back inside. I pulled out the little girl's IV, took the patches off her chest. I washed her body. I wrapped her in a white cloth, and when her father came back inside, I handed him the body of this little girl that I hadn't been able to save, and I said in French, "Je suis désolée," which means, "I'm so sorry." And instead of being angry that we hadn't been able to do more to help his little girl, the father graciously bowed to me and he said, "Thank you." He said, "There is love in your eyes. Thank you. You looked at my baby with love." And then he turned around and he walked home to bury his little girl. I thought that was as hard as Togo would get, but I was wrong. Shortly after that, I got malaria. I got knocked out unconscious in the hospital for a couple days. When I finally got out of the hospital, I was still very weak and sick, and we ran out of water. The whole town ran out of water. For 3 days, it was over 100 degrees, and there was nothing to drink. People started drinking from decades-old cisterns of filthy water. It got incredibly, incredibly sick from the contaminated water, but they were so thirsty, that was all they had to drink. During this time, while I'm watching more people die in a week than I'd seen die in 10 years of practicing medicine in the States, I thought, God, I'm done. I was at my breaking point. I said, God, I'm done. I'm going home. There is nothing you can do. There's nothing that could possibly make me stay in this impossible, devastating situation. Right after I said that to God, there was this huge rainstorm and there was nothing to do but lay on my bed inside, and I started listening to a podcast I downloaded. So the podcast was about the story of Sisyphus. It's a Greek myth And in the myth, Sisyphus makes the gods angry and they condemn him to an eternal punishment. He's going to have to put a rock on his back. He's going to have to carry it up a hill. And every time, just before he gets to the top of the hill, it's going to roll back down. And he has to do this over and over again. And I thought, this is the perfect metaphor for what the hospital felt like for me. That no matter how hard I worked, no matter how hard I tried, every shift I started at the beginning. And I started thinking about the story, and I started thinking about Sisyphus, and all of a sudden I found that I was actually thinking of Jesus. Jesus, the ultimate Sisyphus, who puts the world on his back and carries it up to Calvary. I got super interested in the story, and I started reading more about it. I found that the famous author Albert Camus actually wrote an essay about it. And he says in the essay that we must think of Sisyphus not as the victim of the story, but as the victor. That we must think of Sisyphus as the hero of the story, that we must even think of Sisyphus as happy. And I thought, what in the world? How could this guy possibly be happy? And I kept digging and I kept reading until I came across a poet called Stephen Mitchell, and he wrote a poem about Sisyphus. In the poem, he says that we must think of Sisyphus as happy for one reason, and it's this. Sisyphus is happy because Sisyphus fell in love with the rock. He fell in love with the rock. So it was nothing for him to put it on his back and carry it up. That's exactly what Jesus did for us, right? Jesus fell in love with the world, for God so loved the world that he put us on his back and he carried us up. That afternoon in Togo, for the first time in my life, this verse that I've read at least a million times finally made sense to me. It's 1 Corinthians 13, the last verse of the chapter. It says, now these three things remain, faith, hope, and love, but the greatest of these is love. I don't know about you, but I never understood why out of those three things love was the greatest. And that day in Togo, it dawned on me. So here's the deal. If Sisyphus only had faith, he would have been waiting for God to suspend the laws of gravity so that the rock wasn't heavy or that it didn't roll back downhill. If Sisyphus only had hope, he would have been waiting for a moment in the future where his situation changed and he didn't have to do this anymore. But it was love. It was love that made Sisyphus put the rock on his back and carry it up. My friends, this morning I'm here to invite you to choose to be a person of love. This world is facing many daunting situations, and there is so much that your generation can do about it, but you will not be able to successfully contribute positive things to be able to heal the broken world, to be able to change unjust situations if you settle for anything less than love. You will not change it if you are only a person of faith. If you only believe that somehow God magically is going to work a miracle so that people on the other side of the world get fed and clothed. It will not happen if you think that because you're a person of faith, that because you believe the right set of doctrines on the page, or you show up at Sunday morning and sit there for 90 minutes, that that's enough. It's not enough. You will not change the world if you settle to become a person of solely hope. If you think, well, in the end, God redeems and restores the world, and so I'm just going to sit here and close my eyes and wait it out. You will not be able to change the world that way. You will only be able to change the world if you choose to become a person of love. If you fall in love with the world around you, if you fall in love with your neighbor and love your neighbor as yourself, that kind of love is what will change the world. This morning, I have a specific opportunity for you to make a positive difference in the world. I'm going to tell you a statistic that's a little bit hard to hear, okay? In 2015, there were 6 million children under the age of 5 living in the developing world who died, which means that we lost as many kids in a year as we lost Jews in the Holocaust. It is unconscionable that these children are dying from very preventable causes. But there's something that we can do about it. I have the opportunity to work with an organization that's called Compassion International. Their mission statement is releasing children from poverty in Jesus' name. They go into these poor countries in these impoverished neighborhoods, and they partner with churches to develop these community centers where kids can go and get food and get medical care. They get after-school tutoring. They get nutritious food and clean water, and they have the opportunity to not only survive their childhood, but to begin to thrive and to be able to become leaders in their communities who will raise their own people up and out of poverty. The work that Compassion does is incredible, and you can become a Compassion sponsor today. It's $38 a month. You sponsor a child. That child gets to go to the center and get what they need to be able to survive their childhood, to not become the little girl that dies of tetanus because she didn't have a vaccine, the little girl who dies of malaria because her parents couldn't afford a mosquito net. And then they get to become leaders in their community that raise their countries, that raise their neighborhoods up and out of these intolerable, unspeakable positions. So let's watch this video and you can see what Togo actually does on the ground.
I have the privilege of being here in Togo, West Africa at a Compassion site, and I'm really excited that we get to be here today and see what Compassion does, see what the work actually looks like on the ground. Opportunity to visit Felix, my sponsored child, in his home. His family was kind enough to invite me here, and I got to see what life is really like for them. They live in a small home and they don't have running water or electricity. They have to go to a well. Especially after seeing the conditions that these kids live in, I am so thankful that Compassion is here. That Compassion provides a safe place where kids can go. They can have clean drinking water. They have nutritious food to eat. They have people who help them with their studies and people who love on them in the name of Jesus. To sponsor a child here in Togo and to spend some time with him and his family, and I hope that people will be inspired to do the same thing, to sponsor a child, to change one child's life, and realize that if we all do this, if we all pitch in and we all care for these kids, if we all invest in these children in the name of Jesus, we can watch God literally change the world through these little lives.
My invitation to you this morning, whatever you do with your life, wherever you go, whatever God has for you, is that you commit to becoming a person of love. And my specific challenge to you this morning is that I brought with me packets of these Compassion kids who are waiting for a sponsor. My challenge to you this morning, Point Loma, is that by the end of chapel, all those packets are gone. Because you all stepped up, because you looked at one little life and said, I love you, I believe in you, let's get you out of here. It may cost you something. You may have to not go out to eat on a Friday night and eat at the cafeteria instead. It may cost you some creativity. You may have to get some friends together and say, well, if we each give $5 this month, let's do it together. But whatever it takes, my challenge to you is that you will become a person of love right here, right now, that you will look at the world around you and not think that God's magically going to change it all, that God's going to change it all in the future, so there's nothing that you have to do now, but so that you become a person of love and realize that God has put you on this planet in this time for this. And I hope that you leave here this morning with your hearts excited at what God will do when each of you becomes a person of love, when you put this world on your back and do what it takes to carry it higher. Amen.